Hello, everyone, and welcome to my talk, a spotlight on Section 28. Oh, my lord. My dog has already started causing chaos because I think she managed to get herself tangled in my laptop cord, so apologies for that chaotic start there. Me, are you okay? She's good, we're good. So, hello, everyone, and welcome to my talk. A spotlight on Section 28. My name is Nick Cherryman. I'm a PhD researcher using queer theory and feminist theory to look at drag and gender. I also sometimes perform as a drag performer. I be profane, and I have given lectures on the history of drag. I'm based at the University of Warwick and have been fortunate enough to give this talk, which I hope will at least be interesting and educational to some of you. I touched on Section 28 in a previous talk I gave about moments of crisis in queer history in the UK, and it was suggested that a more in-depth look at Section 28 or Clause 28 would be more beneficial. I have drawn a lot on the work of Jill Spraggs and Sue Sanders, who recorded a lot of the events taking place at the time in an article called Section 28 in Education. And some of you may recognise the name Sue Sanders as both the founder of LGBT History Month in the UK, but also she recently won a Lifetime Achievement Award at the Rainbow Honours last year. She's worked tirelessly over the past 40 years to support the LGBT community, and I just kind of wanted to acknowledge her impact of her work on both this lecture specifically, but also just generally overall. There will be a time for questions after the talk, and there'll be like a quick 2-minute break after the main sort of chunk of me talking at you. And then you can use the opportunity to sort of think of any questions you might have. Ask away. The only thing I'd ask is you leave them on the Queer History Warwick page stream. I think it's been cross-posted from that and the link should all be there. That's just what our moderators primarily going to be looking at. So any questions that you want to sort of get to me for the talk, that's probably going to be the easiest one. And my colleague Sam Parr is helping out with. Thank you, Sam. So, I'm assuming a lot of people here will know what Section 28 is, at least in part, but I will be going into a fair amount of depth, so don't worry if you don't. There aren't, unfortunately, many pictures for this, so it will be primarily me talking at you, and because there's only so many quotes I can sort of throw at you. With that said, there are a few, and they'll sort of appear here in this big magical blank space that I've curated for the talk. It's a wall. But with that, I'm going to try and give a sense of the climate of around Section 28, the introduction of Section 28 itself, and the effects of it at the time. I will also look at the life and death, I use that, it's a very quotational phrase there, of Section 28, and how and if its legacy continues today. I will try and link to parallels of discussions today, because I know for a lot of people watching this, they might not they might be too young to remember Section 28, or maybe they might try and find it hard to sort of make the connections in terms of the real effect in society at the time. I kind of draw on things which hopefully you can relate to a bit more. So, for those that don't know, or have come into this blind, as it were, very, very briefly, Section 28 was introduced by the Tory government in 1988 and prohibited the teaching of acceptability of homosexuality in schools. That's it, at its most basic level. I will, of course, go into more depth to show the sheer scale of effect this had on society at the time, but that's just a one-sentence summary of what it was. So, to begin. In setting the stage, we are in the mid-80s in the UK, and people are adjusting to quite rapid changes in society at the time. England is still kind of reeling from the Tory government making just sweeping cuts and decimating local welfare and support structures for vulnerable people. And meanwhile as well, the UK is shifting and adjusting to recommendations from the Wolfenden Report from 1967, which had mixed results. This was, we're talking about the fallout here, which I covered a bit more in depth in my previous talk for Campus Pride regarding sort of flashpoints or moments of crisis. But basically, Wolfenden Report was the legalisation of consensual same-sex acts, basically, in private for people over 21 only. Whilst offering legal protection, it was also noticeable, though, that the Wolfenden Report recommendation legitimised, sort of counterintuitively, any visible expressions of homosexuality. That is, there was a significant social stigma attached to it, being gay or homosexual, and the ability to now be open about one's sexuality was met with quite complicated social a balancing act, as it was enshrined in law that now homosexuals were actually able to break the law and thus were othered. And by suggesting that the ways that homosexuals could live within the law, and those laws being different to heterosexual couples, kind of othered and highlighted and emphasised the nature of this sort of difference or perception of difference surrounding homosexual couples. Basically, there were normal sexual relationships between heterosexual couples, and then the strange and unusual ones that have now been protected in law because, just by themselves they weren't acceptable. And this social stigma as well wasn't helped by the increasing fear and scaremongering around the AIDS epidemic, which at the time was regarded as the gay plague, that's a quote, and it carved its way through entire communities of LGBT people. If you ask someone at the time who was LGBT and involved in the scene, they probably knew someone personally who had died of HIV or AIDS complications. So, this is the climate that Section 28 was introduced, and it was introduced in its first iteration as a private member's bill in 1986 by the Earl of Halsbury. The second reading of the bill, because it goes through various stages, I'm not going to go hugely in depth on the actual political machinations. The second reading of the bill, entitled, and if you're familiar with the finalised version of Section 28, you'll see the echoes, An Act to Restrain Local Authorities from Promoting Homosexuality. I'm going to read out part of the speech that introduced this reading, and you'll get a better idea of what I'm talking about. It's not an easy listen. Halsbury said, amongst other things, including the idea that gay men were, quote, reservoirs of venereal diseases, he did not think that, quote, lesbians were a problem. They do not molest little girls. They do not indulge in disgusting and unnatural acts like buggery. They are not wildly promiscuous and do not spread venereal disease. It is the part of the softening up of propaganda that lesbians and gays are nearly always referred to in that order. The relatively harmless lesbian leads on the vicious gay. That was what I thought, and what I still in part continue to think. But I have been warned that the loony left is hardening up the lesbian camp and they're becoming increasingly aggressive. Next paragraph, he says, one of the characteristics of our time is that we have for several decades past been emancipating minorities who claim that they were disadvantaged. Are they grateful? Not a bit. We emancipated races and got inverted racism. We emancipate homosexuals and they condemn heterosexism as chauvinist sexism, male oppression and so on. They will push us off the pavement if we give them a chance. Yes, it's unpleasant at best. But there are a couple of things I want to draw out from here, however. Number one, there is clearly a reflection of the long-standing fear of gay men, particularly as paedophiles. The arguments against equality are being presented as rational responses to irrational stereotypes. Any criticism to these charges are unjustified, as the targets are irrational beings and their concerns and responses can be duly dismissed, ignored, or even just not worth engaging with full stop. This is, of course, a rhetoric that is utilised against many minorities today, notably trans people, surrounding the toilet debate, And under the guise that the people against opening up toilets for trans people as well are merely being rational in the face of irrational or the loony left's views. And number two, there is a fear that lesbians are either secretly as bad as or are being tainted by the gays. There is the presentation as well that should these minorities claiming they were disadvantaged be able to sort of collectively gather and mobilise, we would somehow flip this power dynamic rather than attempt to equalise it. There are, of course, current rhetorical parallels here with the Black Lives Matter movement. And that the slogan suggests that, so Black Lives Matter, that slogan is being suggested that they're saying that Black Lives Matter more rather than Black Lives Matter as well. And this is obviously something scary and to be feared because it's damaging to the status quo. This kind of rhetoric carries on throughout this debate constantly, so I won't be pointing out every single time, but just be aware of this kind of constant undercurrent. And even today, like I said, we see it. So, to return to the bill specifically, it was suggested that this was in no way meant to limit any provisions required by gay or lesbian teachers, as it was directly targeting schools primarily, but instead the promotion of lesbian and gay rights. It was designed to, as it was argued, limit the abuses of taxpayers' money on funding these issues, even if in reality the amount being spent was negligible. One of the weaponised items from the right wing included a children's book called Jenny Lives with Eric and Martin. Got a picture here. And it was originally published in Denmark. In 1986, the right-wing tabloids reported that this book was being used in school libraries and acted as a major contribution to the fear that homosexuality was being promoted to young children. I saw an article where one tabloid described it as a book about a little girl who lives with her father and his homosexual lover. Not partner, not stepfather, homosexual lover. In reality, the situation that was being reported was a school run by the Inner London Education Authority had a copy of the book made available to teachers and was only available in, and I quote, exceptional circumstances for older children, and even then only after following consultation with parents. Topics covered in the book include daily events, such as Jenny, Eric and Martin going to the laundrette together, organising a surprise birthday party, and a conversation after a lady makes a homophobic comment to the family in the street. The author, Bush, I apologise for my pronunciation, spoke of the book. I wrote Jenny Lives with Eric and Martin back in 1981 because I became aware of the problems that some children face when meeting family groupings different from the ones they are familiar with, i.e. mum and dad, possibly mum and dad divorced, maybe a step-parent. Horrifying, as you can see. But she also said, and I kind of want to point this out as well, I feel angry that my intentions in writing the book, namely to give children a little more knowledge about the world, have been twisted by grown-up people who chose to use it as a weapon in a political battle. It has also been depressing to see my own words from interviews misrepresented to fit this or that position. For what it's worth, I don't think homosexuality or any other subject should be aggressively promoted in schools, and I do think it should be talked about in an informative, unsensational way. The Halsbury Bill passed in the House of Lords with very little opposition. It did, however, go under various guises. Particularly there was a term in there that shifted an acceptable family relationship to pretended family relationship. And I will bring up a copy of the wording at the end. There's so many changes at this point, there's no reason for me to constantly change all the revisions up. But this is important, this shifting, because it also included the preventing of local authorities to be able to promote homosexuality. And like I said, this then shifted the target of the debate from the classroom, where it was originally held, to pretty much any activities local authorities would be able to work with. The bill failed in the Commons, but not through any organised attempt against it. However, Dame Jill Knight, who was one of the lovely people spearheading the campaign for the bill, mentioned it on Question Time on the 14th of May 1987. This drew huge attention to the bill, and she called on Thatcher to support the bill publicly to protect children and this imagined family. The final piece of this storm in the teacup, the election was coming up, and the bill became a political football to be kicked about. So, things have ramped up. I have a couple of images here for you to see, which is basically Conservative propaganda playing off the idea that they need to introduce this bill to prevent homosexuality being taught to all of our children in schools. Here's one of them. It's obviously anti-Labour. Is this Labour's idea of a comprehensive education? Take the politics out of education, vote Conservative. And the books there say Young, Gay and Proud, Police Out of School, and the Playbook for Kids About Sex. They were clearly utilising this discourse to spook people about Labour policies. There's also this one. My name is Betty Sheridan. I live in Haringey. I'm married with 2 children and I'm scared. If you vote Labour, they'll go on teaching my kids about gays and lesbians instead of giving them proper lessons, and it's signed by her. Betty Sheridan, by the way, wasn't anyone in particular that I could find. I think she was just some rando that they shoved on a poster, and obviously she is keen to let you know she is scared. This particular poster actually was reported and attacked by the Advertising Standards Authority owing to the misrepresentation of the reality of the situation regarding teaching sex education, which was similar around the country at the time and literally just involved consulting about what can be taught in schools with no implementation at this point. To quote Sue Sanders and Jill Spraggs at this point, I mentioned their article, they adroitly point out that this rhetoric, particularly the quote by Thatcher that children who need to be taught to respect traditional moral values are being taught they have an inalienable right to be gay, and all of these children are being treated of a sound start in life, is actually indicative of the belief that lesbians and gays had no inalienable right to be, to even just exist in Tory Britain. I don't really have anything to add to that. I think Thatcher's record is more than capable of speaking to itself, and Sanders and Spragg summarise extremely well. Moving forward, as we know, the Tories won the election. The bill went through various names, but is essentially what we now know as Section 28 of the Local Government Act of 1988. To be specific about where we are in revisions, Section 28 prohibited local councils and schools from promoting the teaching of the acceptability of homosexuality as a pretended family relationship. I would also like to point out that this particular phrase, pretended family relationship, was picked up as awful even at the time, but was actively defended by Halsbury, the private member who brought forward the bill, because, and I quote, "It is part of homosexual propaganda that the family is a form of male chauvinism, which is not something I believe should be said." He of course here means a very specific type of family, the heteronormative nuclear family. And this is another attempt to use the terrain of education to defend actions before shifting the goalposts entirely to a broader sphere in society by the Tories. This no longer concerned education, but was an attempt to control even publishing homosexual material by local authorities. Interestingly, the main political opposition, the Labour Party, opposed the part regarding schools, reflecting pastoral issues mainly, concerns over how people would address them in schools, but supported the argument that this shouldn't have a place in local authorities. The biggest problem with this, however, is that promoting homosexuality, whatever that means, was never even within the remit of the local authorities, though I will return to this in a bit. Surrounding all of this, as it was moving through Parliament, I do want to point out there was a rather large spike in attacks on LGBT people. It was clear the publicity surrounding this clause was causing an increase in anti-LGBT plus activists. And there was an arson attack on a gay newspaper. There was tear gas thrown into gay bars, and there was even a bomb left at a disco. In turn, however, this gave LGBT people an opportunity to rally against something, and there are alliances forming against this. An example of which is over 800 activists protested outside the House of Commons by a recently formed organisation for lesbian and gay action. Discussion was becoming more polarised from right-wing politics on media on one side and this loony left activism on the left. I will go more into the response to this. At this point, although legally there were big strides towards section, still currently called Clause 28 passing, by January 1988 there was press coverage everywhere regarding opposition to this clause. This is primarily because of the big names and organisations against the clause, rather than any sort of moral outrage being reported. A lot of quite famous actors in theatre and film were speaking out about this. More and more, however, there was an increase in those publicly speaking against Clause 28, as the vague language of the clause itself meant many feared action tantamount to witch hunts, and the use of language like publish, which was also what's the word I'm looking for? Defined in law. I've got the word there. Sorry. As publish simply means to circulate or make available. So all of a sudden, this now also affects libraries, museums, and other educational groups. And others worried that this would cull any support for support networks for LGBT clients, in case it's seen as funding the homosexual lifestyle. So, for example, counselling services available to them. Even at this point, the Bishop of Manchester spoke out against this and said it was stoking the terrible dangers of encouraging prejudice. Well, one second. We all know what happened. Eventually this, with a bit of back and forth, went through in May 1988 under the name of Prohibition of Promoting Homosexuality by Teaching or by Publishing Material. I would really strongly recommend looking at the Sanders and Sprague's article for a much more in-depth breakdown of exactly what happened step by step. And I've drawn a lot on this so far. It is by far the most memorable, the most thorough contemporary report of the events taking place, and includes memorable moments in all of this, including two particularly famous events. One was the abseiling lesbians into the House of Lords in February, and there was also the raiding of the 6 o'clock news on the 23rd of May 1988, the day before the law became operative. So, this has been, admittedly, a rather lengthy breakdown of what exactly happened from a legal and procedural perspective. But what happened afterwards? Where does this leave the UK in the late 1980s after this law was in effect? I will put up the wording here exactly, as I really appreciate I have bounced around a lot and thrown a lot of quotes at you. So, the prohibition of promoting homosexuality by teaching or by publishing material. A local authority shall not A. intentionally promote homosexuality or publish material with the intention of promoting homosexuality, and B. promote the teaching of in any maintained school of the acceptability of homosexuality as a pretended family relationship. Nothing in subsection 1 above shall be taken to prohibit the doing of anything for the purpose of treating or preventing the spread of disease. Now, this is vague as anything when we're looking at any sort of practical application. How do you check the intention of promoting acceptability of a sexual identity in a family relationship that is apparently pretended? The whole thing is a mangling of clarity and highlights this back and forth that took place, meaning that what was left was this quite vague and fuzzy attempt, but still very clear attempt to discriminate against the LGBT community, which can be taken as both meaningless but also terrifyingly catch-all in its range. I'm also not just retrospectively making this claim, to be clear, like with the benefit of hindsight. A government spokesman made what I think is frankly a jaw-dropping statement to a journalist for The Teacher about the implications of the word promote in January 1988. When asked, what does this mean? They said, "We're a little unclear what the word means ourselves, but the government is happy with the word, even though there is a little uncertainty over what it means. If it comes to trial, it'll be up to the courts to decide." Like, I mean to highlight this there, as there was, much like the bill, very little substance to grab onto in terms of direct response. Retrospectively, I don't think this was inherently bad, or it could have been much worse, I should say, as it was so vague and the anxiety of the reach of this clause was so great, it mobilised many, many groups to act against this as a symbol of anti-LGBT politics. That is, it wasn't just a battle for a niche like LGBT law group, for example, or an LGBT social group. This was so vague as to affect everyone. So everyone was trying to look at how to pitch in. But again, I'll come back to that. Coupled with all of this, there was actually very little the local authorities could do with schools, as sex education at this point rested with the school governing bodies, not the local authorities, who maintained an advisory role only and actually had very little to do with the day-to-day application of actual education in sex education. This does not mean, however, that people just ignored it. This vagueness led to people overcompensating to make sure they could not be accused of breaking the law at all. And instead what followed was a culture of silence and self-censorship that damaged any sort of normalising discourse around non-heteronormative relationships in education. I'm using the term non-heteronormative here because, well, homosexuality, as a term, doesn't actually have a definition in law, or it didn't then. I don't believe it still has a legal definition today. But if anyone does know of one, please do say in the comments. Everything so far in law involves same-sex relationships or homosexual acts. Homosexuality, however, what does that encompass within this sphere in law, which is what this bill is directly targeting? Now, despite the protests and the uproar I've described in terms of response to this, this was still past what was the height of homophobia in the UK. In 1987, there was a peak in negative attitudes towards homosexuality, particularly following the years of negative media portrayals in relation to AIDS, as I discussed earlier. I mean to say, despite people rallying around and lots of people getting together in response to this, it was still vastly outnumbered by the general feelings towards homosexuality in society. In 1987, the British Social Attitude Survey showed that 75% of British people felt that homosexuality was, and I quote, always or mostly wrong, and only 11% saying it was never wrong. To give a comparison, in 2018, 16%, said it was always or mostly wrong, with 66% saying it was never wrong. And I'm not trying to say this is particularly good, I'm just trying to give you an idea of the sort of shift in scale. There were also pretty abhorrent comments by then MPs, such as Conservative MP Peter Brunvels, who commented, and I quote, "I do not agree with homosexuality. I think that Clause 28 will help outlaw it and the rest will be done by AIDS, with a substantial number of homosexuals dying of AIDS. I think that's probably the best way." Now, this has since been repealed in 2003 to 4 and in 2000 in Scotland, but looking at what this did at the time is interesting. The Act itself undeniably had an effect, even if no one was actually ever prosecuted or challenged for breaching the Act. For many schools, for fear that it would be targeted, rolled back on any discussion of homosexuality and homosexual relationships. And as I said, this galvanised movements in the UK, as it gave a specific target of focus for many groups that had fragmented as time had gone on with different aims. Most famously of these now is Stonewall, the charity, which was actually created as a direct response to Section 28 by actor Ian McKellen, Lisa Power and Lord Cashman. Ian McKellen, of course, also came out famously in the wake of Section 28 to speak against it. Ironically, despite the very real effect in schools in an attempt to quash any sort of normalisation of non-heteronormative relationships, the response was to cause a bit of an explosion of charitable causes. Stonewall, for example, is now one of the world's most powerful charities when it comes to campaigning and lobbying for LGBT rights. Admittedly, it was a bit slow on the trans rights, but it's getting there, hopefully. Considering this was a direct response to Section 28, it appears to have managed to, and I'm keen to stress this only in the long run, the complete opposite effect. Immediately after, however, it was a slightly different story. The clause split opposition to it down the middle. There were those that were outraged and vocal, such as abseiling lesbians, but there were those who were unhappy but silent, for various reasons, including, particularly for teachers, the scarce job protection they had they been openly gay or lesbian employees. They were, understandably given the climate at the time and the severe dislike of homosexuality, keeping their heads below the parapet, as it were. As I said, after the bill passed, there was this immediately stifling of conversation around the topic, and this I found when researching this in particular quite difficult to sort of find things on in an empirical sense, because by its very nature, I'm talking about things that didn't happen, these discussions. Instead, most of these stories are stories that have been passed down anecdotally and through oral histories, and instead it's been easier to measure the long-term effects of Section 28. For a very long time, homosexuality simply just wasn't included in any curriculum. And the first attempt at repeal came in February 2000 from the Labour government as part of the Local Government Act of 2000. It passed in Scotland. Well done, Scotland. But it wasn't successful elsewhere in the UK. Theresa May, the each Prime Minister, called it, quote, victory for common sense. Much as Thatcher can speak for herself, I think I'll let Theresa speak for herself there. Instead, it finally passed in 2003 when it was brought up again, and this is when it passed into the rest of the UK, except Kent. For whatever reason, they decided they didn't like this, and they included their own version of Section 28 into their local county council, stating, quote, we will ensure that sex education values family and marriage as the foundation of civilised society and a firm basis for the nurturing of children. Of course, that means any couples that are no longer married or aren't married or don't have children are also just kind of swept away with this particularly nasty phrasing. And it took the Equal Rights Act, the Equality Act of 2000, to change this. So what had happened by then? We've had all of the 90s there, the end part of the 80s, and the beginning part of the 2000s. Well, I remember Section 28 being repealed whilst I was in school, and having to look up on the dial-up computer at home secretly. Hi, Mum, you didn't know this. Secretly on the dial-up computer at school, because I didn't know what it was, but I knew it was something to do with being gay, which is something I was kind of coming to terms with. I was only 12 years old when it was being repealed. There were several years afterwards where I was still getting heteronormative sex education after this had changed. Because, well, by this point, there was a culture of non-discussion. And there was no infrastructure either, or real curriculum information, nothing. I left school in 2009, 6 years after the Section 28 was repealed, and for all practical purposes, nothing had changed. I was speaking to some peers yesterday actually about this, and the only one of them, and they're all around my age, who recognised any same-sex sex education was one who grew up in Brighton. And she was the first to say it was probably because she was in Brighton that she got that, rather than anything specific from a legal perspective. Now, I am aware that change doesn't happen overnight. I'm not saying it should happen like that. But I think it's hard to understate quite how pernicious and insidious this law was. Legally, things have shifted, but culture takes much longer to shift. And this was not helped by the effect that Section 28 had in these public conversation and arenas elsewhere. By which I say, museums and libraries were also affected as well in other similar other educational organisations. Again, a lot of these stories are anecdotal and passed down through oral histories because we're talking about things that didn't happen. But I've asked queer people who work in museums through various networks that I have and who work on queer topics in museums. And the general consensus was that this kind of prevented any discussion of it as well, when there was already extremely limited coverage of LGBT history and stories in the first place. One of the people I spoke to mentioned they believed the V&A Museum tried to cleverly work this system by collecting items under public health, which was of course allowed under this particular legislation, as it was talking about how nothing would hinder this if it was to do with disease. Of course, what they were referring to there, unspoken, was AIDS. So they couldn't be accused of promoting homosexuality, but merely in the interests of public health. Libraries as well, which already fall under criticism still today for holding books that people are, of course, under no obligation to read, were also very careful about making available books that could be possibly accused of promoting homosexuality. Of course, one of the main catalysts was that book earlier, Jenny Lives with Eric and Martin. So their reluctance to even potentially further court controversy and lose all funding from local authorities and councils is understandable. It was very much a case of, we'll keep doing what we can, even if it means ignoring how we can help people who need help the most. Perhaps that's a little bit unfair. I don't know, it's hard to tell. As someone who was directly impacted from this legislation, even though it came out before I was born, I can look at what we have now and see that things have improved. Again, not without controversy. I guess a similar debate we're still dealing with now is the No Outsiders project by Andrew Moffat in Birmingham, which was to do with lessons engaging with same-sex relationships and transgender issues in schools. This caused full-blown protests outside primary schools in Birmingham, and Moffat was both vilified and lauded on either side of the debate. Again, to give an idea of the kinds of things that are being proposed to be used in these lessons, one of the texts for young children included a story about a dog that didn't feel like he fit in. And there was another one about two male penguins raising a chick together. I actually have a picture of this one. It's based on a true story. The actual penguins, that's them there. It's called Tango Makes Three, and it was Roy and Silo that raised, you guessed it, the chick called Tango. And they got the egg, which came about after they tried to hatch a rock. I'm not saying they're the smartest animals in the planet, okay? But the zookeepers gave them an egg from a heterosexual couple who are unable to hatch an egg. I'm aware that talking about penguins as heterosexual couples is a bit of a strange thing, but I'm working with what I've got here. This practice of male penguins now raising eggs has apparently been adopted around the world because they were pretty good at it. I have no news on lesbian penguins, unfortunately, but if you do know any, please do say so in the comments. I also want to point out here that recent predictions suggested that the number of trainee teachers identifying as LGBT entering Teach First has, in just literally a few years, increased from 5% to 9%, and it's all my generation. Many of them say that, and these were direct questions, stated that the fact that their lack of education on these topics and the way it made them feel in school encouraged many of them to be the role models and teachers that they did not have themselves growing up. And I kind of struggle to see how that's not just kind of a wonderful step forward given the circumstances, that so many people are taking the opportunities to provide the support for those who need it. It's nice to think that intake nearly doubled from 5 to 9%. However, much as I've taken a kind of light tone on this particular topic right now, I don't want to lighten the effect this directly had on people involved. Moffat himself has had death threats suggesting he wouldn't last long, and the opposition has fallen heavily on religious divisions stating Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve, on banners outside schools, as well as similar slogans as well. The organiser of the protests has come out with gems like, quote, "We have traditional family values and morally we do not accept homosexuality as a valid sexual relationship to have." The echoes with the legislation of Section 28 in this is evident, with the pretended and accepted family relationship. He also came out with, "We do not believe in homosexuality, but that does not make us homophobic," and that this was not about gay and lesbian rights and equality, it's purely about proselytizing homosexual ways of life to children. You've noticed I've not said this man's name, nor will I. I will not give any further promotion to him, but instead, as you've probably guessed it, I'll let his words speak for himself. Well, where are we now? Well, that debate with the schools out happened literally less than a year ago, and it hurts me to say that this debate is not over, nor do I think it will be over anytime soon. What I think is more likely is the terrain is going to shift gradually and new battles will come out. I'm not going to pretend I know exactly where I think this will be, but my money would be on trans rights and identities that fall outside of currently understood gender binaries. What's this got to do with Section 28? You're probably asking. Well, Section 28 hindered discussion on gay rights for 15 years in law and even longer culturally. So I want to ask, what can we do to learn for future fights? Young queer people have much higher rates of mental health problems, bullying, and they attempt to and often succeed in much higher rates to die by suicide. Imagine how much pain could have been spared had discussion in the formative years of people's lives been focused on positive representations of LGBT lives rather than demonising them. Imagine how much further in the discussion we could be about making lives for marginalised people acceptable or livable. Now, I didn't really want to end this on a really down note, but I don't honestly think there's an alternative if we're talking about this. Section 28 was one of the most homophobic and destructive laws in the UK in literally decades, if not centuries. To understate its impact is impossible. It truly fucked over a generation of young gay people, and a generation that I belong to. And I'm still damn angry about it. And to be frank, I think more of us should be angry about it. I can't change the past, as I said, but I feel like the battle lines are being redrawn for another battle. And like I said, this time I think maybe on trans rights. How about this time we all get angry and fight for the right side of history on this battle and not halt progression for another 15 to 20 years? With that, I'm going to take a quick break for 2 minutes. Please feel free to leave questions on the Queer History workstream, and my colleague Sam will collate any that come up, and I'll try and answer what I can. So I'll be back soon. Hi, I'm back. Um, hopefully, I've got everything working again. Um, yes, there we are. I think we are. Ooh. Um, so I've had a couple of questions. Um, one of them was, how can we apply what we've learned from Section 28 to future battles, particularly around trans rights? So that's an interesting question. So one of the one of the things that came out of this discussion when I was researching it is the suggestion that people at the time, one of the founders of Stonewall, was an interview I listened to with some of the founders of Stonewall. They were saying that at the time, particularly in the arts industry, people could just kind of be gay and they just got on with their life. And there was very much this sense of equality that was there. And they said that when Section 28 came in, they said it was like to quote, a thunderbolt, I think a bolt of thunder, I think was the words they used, that kind of shocked them into going like, oh my God, actually, we do not have this. This is not good. So for me, in relation to that, I guess the kind of thing I have to kind of point out here is not to get complacent. And I don't think, to be honest with you, any of us are complacent in terms of trans rights. I think, at least in the circles that I go in. Unfortunately, I'm also in the circles that would have gone, yeah, we can be gay, it's chill, I don't care. But being aware of what is coming and how precarious these rights are that we've secured, I think is particularly important. A good example of this is the Gender Recognition Act, I think is coming in. I believe there's a talk coming up on the Gender Recognition Act by my colleague who's moderating, Sam. I might be mistaken about that though, but I believe it's coming up on the campus Pride events. But again, there's this sense of very rational responses to irrational stereotypes. And these irrational stereotypes don't actually exist, just to be clear. They're kind of fictional constructs of what trans people are. Trans people are predators. They're not, just to make it abundantly clear where I'm coming from. But they construct this image and then respond to this image. So systematically not allowing these images to go ahead and fighting against that stereotype, I think, is really important. And not getting complacent, because otherwise it will flip very quickly to something which causes similar actions like this. Liz Truss is doing the rolling back on the GRA. That's something, for example, that is being used under this rhetoric. So we kind of have to take what we can and I think mobilise as we can, where we can, without fractioning off again. One of the reasons this was so sort of successful in terms of making the news was, I think, people vocally and consistently speaking out against it. And just whilst I'm here, do that against the rollback on the GRA, because the basically it's just ripping apart trans rights. So write to your MP, there's plenty on there online, just search for it. So I don't have a definitive answer, but I kind of hope that that's kind of an answer of where we're going. I have another question. What do you see as the best way that somebody who doesn't directly belong to the LGBTQ plus community to support young people who do, or who are trying to clarify where they are at and belong? Listen to them. I think it's the same for any marginalised group. There's a balancing act, and I appreciate this isn't an easy balancing act at times, between allowing people the space to speak for themselves, whilst appropriately standing up when needed. For young people in particular, often they need a role model, I believe anyway, to take those steps forward and sort of go, it's okay. I think being a role model in what is and isn't acceptable, actively calling out when you see um, terms thrown around, um, challenging when you can, and I guess normalising the fact that certain behaviours aren't acceptable, because we've got that culture at the minute where certain behaviours are normalised, and actually we need to sort of reject that entirely and push back and go, this shouldn't be normalised. And again, this is the same for any minority. Terms used about people of colour, old terms regarding like terms like queer or pufta, things like that. But like, actually, that's not okay. You don't get to say that. That's not an acceptable thing. I think is probably the best way. And creating this normalization of culture of what is and isn't acceptable, I think is probably one of the best ways. For example, don't let things be dismissed as locker room talk, to use Trump's phrase here. Don't let Trump's comment about grabbing women be normalised and let people dismiss it. No, it's not locker room talk. Like, it's not. And the same goes for any phrase. Like, I don't talk like that in the locker room, I can assure you. You know, just make sure that's heard. And that can sometimes just be, depending on where you are. I actually know the person who wrote this question. So I know this person isn't necessarily in the middle of a city. They're in quite a rural area. When you can, for those of you who are more able to, I think this normalisation is super important. There was another one. So I'm just reading the comments. As a parent, I've seen negative responses. Thanks. Yeah. Yeah, so I kind of just, these aren't questions, but I am going to just sort of point out some of these comments for those because I think they are really important. There was one person who was saying they've seen negative responses to things such as drag queen story time, but also they've seen organisations like local museums refusing to bow to bigots and doing the right thing, which, great. It's brilliant. I can't imagine what it was like for queer parents in the 80s without the plethora of LGBT-related books for kids like there is now to help children to see themselves. Yeah. Yeah. One moderator just drew that attention to me as well. And there was another one as well about pointing out there was a discussion I believe was recorded. Yes, it was recorded because I didn't make it. Because I was working on this lecture. I'll need to watch. But it was worth mentioning that in the decolonization talk yesterday, half of nations which criminalise homosexuality are part of the British Commonwealth, and it was us, the British, that sort of established those laws. And much as Section 28 was very much focused within the UK, this particular comment drew attention to, and absolutely correctly so, that with our history of colonialisation as British people, we have a much broader legacy that we are responsible for. And we're not just talking about the effects of people today in the UK, like me. I mean, I've spoken about it in a very personal way at times, but there are people all over the world of all ages who have been sort of disproportionately affected by that. In short, I'm going to wrap up there. I know that probably wasn't the upbeat ending that we all wanted. Unfortunately, it's not a particularly upbeat sort of topic. But yes, I'll leave it there. I just want to say thank you to everyone for tuning in. And I'll step off. I did have a screen that went black, but I've misplaced it. So it's probably just going to be a blank wall for a bit until it all wraps up. So with that, thank you.